Hmm.
1400 years, ere seas sown, truth was twisted, its seeds were grown. Break the lies, spark the mission. Welcome to Quranic Inquisition.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Peace of the Lord to all of you. Shalom, assalamu alaikum, namaste. Welcome back to the channel where we are going to talk again about more stuff from that we find in the Quran. So, as always, with us, Kash. Hello, Kash. How are you today?
I'm doing well. How are you, JC?
I am very well. So, Kash, you're looking forward to today's session. What have you got prepared for us today?
I'd like to talk a little today about this idea of the cradle and how it relates to one particular verse, which we're going to look at in detail, as well as this concept of Mahdi and maybe their relation to each other or lack thereof, who knows. But I want to look at this idea of the cradle and see what exactly do we have going on with that verse where we get this story. Because we're told essentially, okay, this verse in the surah is talking about Jesus speaking as a baby in the cradle. And this is then essentially finds its justification then in the idea that this comes from a apocryphal gospel. This is the infancy gospel of Thomas, if I recall correctly. And there's story of the Arabic infancy gospel of our Savior. There's like terms like this. So the essential position of most people today is, from the Christian side, you guys are taking apocryphal stories that shows how you're false, and then Muslims saying, this is the word of God, he spoke in the cradle, that's it. So everyone seems to be in consensus, whether Christian, Muslim, or otherwise, that what this text is talking about is this idea of Christ speaking as a baby in the cradle. So we're going to examine that and look at exactly whether that's the full truth. But before we do that, I want to put forward this. The Mahdi, right? We have now this guy in the modern day claiming to be the Mahdi, right? So this concept is now bubbling up. So there's this guy claiming to be Mahdi over the entire history of the Islamic region. There were many people who called themselves Mahdi. It then takes on this eschatological meaning. It then gets expanded in the Hadith traditions to essentially be this promised figure that is to come, is linked with eschatological aspects. However, the crucial problem, though, is that it's not in the Quranic text itself. There is no Mahdi in the Quran. So that begs the question, okay, if the Shias and Sunnis both have this idea of the Mahdi, then it isn't some sectarian later, development. It seems to go all the way back to the original early 7th century, if not before. So the question then is, okay, how is it that there's this consistently among Shia and Sunni alike developed and adhered to tradition of a Mahdi coming when it's not in the Quranic text? So JC, what do you think about that? Just that general gist. Like we have a Mahdi idea, but it's not in the Quran.
That is an interesting question. I saw the Mahdi as being the character promised to the Shia more than the Sunnis, because they think that the Mahdi is like the 12th Imam who went into exile in 932 or 936, something like that. And at one point he returns, and we know what needs to happen before he returns. And then he brings forth like the true Quran, which was not altered by Uthman and all of those things. So it's bizarre, and people have actually appeared saying that they are the Mahdi, particularly one now trending on social media, which is quite interesting. But yeah, I know kind of the punchline of this, that Mahdi was originally introduced in the Quran, but now hidden, right?
It's ironic, yeah. And the Shia
Mhm.
idea of the Mahdi, where they elevate it for this particular instance, right? Because they have their 12 Imams, but obviously once the 12th Imam is there, how do you have a 13th Imam when the framework is that there are these 12? Then the idea is then this 12th one was the Mahdi. then he went into hiding, and then he will return, right? So the Shia have their particularized, this is the Mahdi who will return. However, we don't have we do have a Mahdi idea in Sunni, right? It's Sunni in East. They just don't identify this Mahdi figure as being the 12th Imam who will come back. So it's this shared idea. They differ about the particulars, but the Mahdi idea it does unite the Shias and Sunnis. But again, where does this concept come from? So here's a segment, which is the text we're going to be looking at. We're looking specifically at verse 29, which is cut off at the end. But I'm going to read this out. That way we get the gist of the context, so that when we go into it, we know what we're talking about. So this is in Surah 19, Surah Maryam. And I'll read from the top. That way we get the full context. So this is from the Murad translation. So some of the words are going to be left as question marks, and I will read them as such. We're just going to not worry about them for now. So she bore him, and then discarded herself by him into a remote place. So this is after the birth of Jesus, presumably. And then we get, so the birth pangs made her come unto the trunk of the palm tree. She said, "O blank, died before this, and were a forgotten forgetfulness." So he called her from beneath her, that do not grieve thy Lord, has already rendered a blank beneath thee, presumably related to Christ somehow. And vibrate unto thee by the trunk of the palm tree, it shall continuously drop moist blank over thee. So eat and drink, settle eyewise, so either thou see anyone from the mortal having skin, then say, surely I have vowed a fasting for al-rahman, so I will never talk to a human being today. So she advanced by him, her menfolk, bearing him. They said, O Maryam, indeed thou hast come a fabricated thing. This is in the Murad. When it goes to the Sin translations of that particular fabricated quote-unquote thing, there's more to be said about that, and I have investigated that, but we'll leave that out for now. But it's related to Christ, essentially. There's something, whether it's fabricated or whether it's wonderful. Basically, if you look at the Sin translations, one translator will say monstrous thing, the other will say amazing thing. So this word is definitely dubious, given the fact that the translators can't agree upon it. So we continue. This is where it gets important. O sister of Harun. So this is already kind of an issue. People talk about it a lot, about why is Mary associated as the sister of Harun. There's multiple explanations that are provided. One of them is, it's symbolically a brother, yada, yada, yada. But we'll put that aside for now. O sister of Aaron, thy father was not an affrontive gentleman, and thy mother was not intrusive. So she referred unto him. They said, how should we talk with he who was a boy in the smoothness, is how Murad finishes that. And that's the verse we're going to be looking at. So the context here is there's the birth of Christ, then there's like, Mary goes to a remote place after giving birth to him or bearing him. So maybe after conception, then she discards her place, and essentially this is all post-birth of Christ. There's something about al-rahman with fasting and so forth. But now the context is we have Mary referring to him. This is Christ. And we read this as it being a boy, as we see in Murad, because of the word Sabian. So let's have a look specifically at this verse, 19:29, where it starts with how, this is in the middle of the verse, but we're specifically focusing on this part here. And it reads, well, this first, here's the manuscript. The reference is for the Wettstein 1913. This is the one we're going to be looking at specifically for the presentation today. So we're looking first at this word just to go through. That way everything is firmly attested. Okay, Kaifa, I looked at this in the Syriac. I think it's also attested in Aramaic, Syriac. So this seems pretty solid. So it's how. It's rendered very consistently as how and throughout the Quranic text. So we can be pretty confident. So how. Next word is this Nun Kaf Lam Mim, which is Kaf Lam Mim root, which is the kalimat, right? The word of God. So kalam is word, speech, right? So nu kalamin would be we speak. So that's how it's rendered here. We speak. Okay, fair enough. Continue. Min. This one is it can be used either from or who. So we can see it's attested very consistently as who. So we can be happy with that. Okay. Kana is an interesting word. I'm just putting it up here as a point of interest as well. which is the fact that we have kana attested in the Syriac, in the Gez, and in the Arabic. However, they don't act the same way, so it is worth noting because in past streams we pointed out how the translators will render kana as present tense, even though the proper Arabic for kana is actually that it's past tense. However, that said, in the Syriac and in the Gez, the form kana is actually itself present tense, which is interesting because if we're going to put forward that a lot of the meanings derive from the Syriac, from the Gez, then even kana itself, where we're critical of the Islamic translators when they put it as present tense, and we say, no, 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 we insist you translate it properly according to Arabic grammar and say that this is past tense, even that itself is a little bit dubious and worth investigating. And of course, I put the screenshot here where you can see the exact same form, the same diacritics, and in one instance, it's translated as is, and then 4 verses later, you see it's translated as was. So there's no consistency actually in how the Arabic translators translate kana, which is a bit messy. But that's the word we're dealing with here. So to point out of interest is that it takes the meaning of dwell as well, which is a side meaning, but maybe relevant, right? So the next word is one of these other words which is quite consistent. This is the word fi. It means in. Fair enough, simple. Now we're looking at the more difficult words. And I want to go over what Tabari actually writes. And he's already like roughly almost 200 years essentially after the emergence of the textual tradition. So we're now already in the year, well, actually, no, it's more like almost 300 years rather. So we're in the year 915 here, where it supposedly was finished. And even that, we get the manuscripts later, so, but we can attest. So, okay, the point being here is that the earliest tafsir writer, which is Tabari, he doesn't really know what it means, in the sense that it's used for people. Well, essentially, I'll read through this. So it's used as a regnal or honorific title for rulers. So the Abbasid Caliph bears the title al-Mahdi. This is Muhammad bin Abi Jafar, but he simply has a throne name from Tabari's narration, right? We also see this as Tabari reporting that rebel leaders also took on the title. So, for example, Abdallah al-Nafs al-Zakiya had led a revolt, and with the letters opening from Muhammad bin Abdallah the Mahdi. So this was a title that was super important to the sense that people who were leading revolts, as well as people in power, they were adopting this title. So it seems to have been there in the ancestral memory. Like this was an important title, but it's not in the Quran. So we have to explain where it comes from. We don't know where it comes from, it seems, but it's important. People are using it. Caliphs are using it. Revolutionaries are using it. It seems everyone's using it, right? Also, it seems to be a propaganda label bestowed by caliphs in the sense that Abu Jafar al-Mansur, anxious to delegitimize that revolt, dismisses the claimant, then admits he styled his own son al-Mahdi only as good politics, not because he believed in eschatological redeemer. So there's a lot of messy stuff going on. This title, this name holds power in some sense, even if, let's say, this person, if they're being truthful, they named their son Mahdi as good politics, right? But that means that the name meant something. It mattered for it to be good politics. So regardless of Tabari's, let's say, lack of firm definition of what exactly this Mahdi is, he does essentially loosely understand it as rightly guided, where he uses, in his chronicles, he refers to certain governors, pious figures, or early caliphs in set phrases such as fa kana Mahdiyan, where the iyan ending is of that. So they were of Mahdi, effectively, right? So they were of the rightly guided, presumably. That's sort of the way Tabari uses it. So point being is that this word seems to be super important. Everyone's using it. Everyone's waiting for the Mahdi. It's not in the Quranic text, apparently. And at the time of Tabari, it's already kind of lost its exact meaning. But everyone cares about it. So everyone uses it. So what Tabari's treatment tells us is there's no fixed doctrine yet, even in the 920s, 915. He never pauses to define Mahdi. He doesn't cite any canonical hadith about an end-time redeemer, right? Because we have these hadith traditions later that really flesh out the Mahdi concept theologically, eschatologically, and all that as an end-time redeemer, right? But there's no understanding in Tabari. that this is the idea. So therefore, one, we could see that Tabari clearly didn't have access to these later hadiths that were talking about the Mahdi in such great detail. Um, so there's an issue here. It's the widespread currency. We saw that. We talked about that. The political elasticity and so on. Anyway, point being is the key takeaway is that Mahdi seems to be familiar and massively used by caliphs and rebels alike. However, it's not clear what exactly it means. Okay, so let's look at the root itself. So the root, when you look at the concordance for the root, you see various forms in different contexts. So one meaning it takes up is the resting place. However, this is written differently, right? You see that when you have it is the resting place here, it has an extra aleph. And when you see it here as taking the meaning of the cradle down here, that's the form we're looking at, aleph lam mim ha dal. So if you have the extra aleph, it actually changes the root. So it might be related, but it's probably a different root. It has probably a different meaning. So we're looking specifically at this whole cradle word, which appears as the meaning of cradle 3 times in Surah 3, 5, and 19. We're looking at the one in 19 specifically here. As well as, interestingly, we see that it also appears in another form, where instead of the alif lam definite article, it seems that it has essentially another occurrence, but instead of the alif lam, we have the alif suffix, which could tie into our thesis about the definite articles. That being that the Aramaic suffix a would then be rendered essentially into the alif lam definite article. This thesis would essentially say that these words are identical, if that is correct. But for
If I
now,
may jump in
yes.
just for a second. So in the word as it is rendered now as Mahdi, the E sound is accomplished through the fatha that is added, of course, probably 9th or 10th century. So the word as written in the Quran, it will probably be read as Mahda because they wouldn't have the sound E unless they otherwise would have probably added a Ya. So this one that you said that it ends with an aleph might actually be closer to the original rendering of the word than Mahdi with the ending Y. Just that observation.
That's very interesting also. Yeah, true, true. Okay, because then it would retain the memory of the pronunciation. The phonetic would retain, but the meaning is lost. Interesting. Okay, yeah, fair enough. So we're looking then at this Mahdi word, but so I want to first show other context. So the initial counter argument, if I were to propose that Mahdi, by the way, it's pronounced Mahdi because, like you said, you have the diacritic on the final D here, right? So you actually pronounce it Mahdi, right? But it's not meant to be connected to al-Mahdi, right? Pronunciation is no different given this diacritical, putting of the I sound as a diacritic here. So that's why it initially caught my attention, simply because of the phonetic similarity. So in the context of Mahdi, the right away the counter argument will be, well, of course it's cradle, because in the context of Surah 5, verse 110, we see Mahdi in this other place, where in the context it reads, my favor upon you and upon your mother. So it's clearly about Jesus. When I strengthened you with the spirit of holiness. I don't see it on my own end. I have to move this other way. Okay, yeah. The spirit of holiness. So yes, okay, it's definitely about Jesus. Okay, fair enough. So then it says, you spoke al-nas, which I have questions about. But anyway, to the people, fi in the cradle, right? So the idea here is that, oh, it must mean cradle because this other word after, wakalan, means maturity. So by contrast, because one means maturity, and in the context, it would presumably mean that therefore he's talking to people in youth and in maturity, therefore youth is represented by cradle here, and that makes sense of it, presumably. However, I looked at this other word, the word for maturity. And one moment, just gonna get back on the slides here. This word is quite interesting in the sense that I would identify it. We spoke before of rotten roots. I would identify this as a case of a rotten root, because we have this source in the Hebrew scriptures of this idea of the assembly or the congregation, and this is used then more and more emphasized in contexts of God, as in God's assembly, as in in His presence, in His domain, right? His assembly, His congregation. So the QHL, then phonetically, the kaf in the Hebrew very often becomes the K in the Aramaic and the Syriac and so on. So you can see that development, right? So you can track the origin coming from the QHL root in the Hebrew scriptures. Then it takes the phonetic and representation in the Aramaic and Syriac as KHL, therefore deriving the meaning directly from the Hebrew as being assembly, congregation, multitude. Um, However, then we get, Ethiopic stays faithful, congregation, assembly, it's used liturgically, right? And then we get to Arabic, and it's a totally different meaning. It means to be a middle-aged, mature man. I couldn't explain why. But that's how what it means. It's not used for assembly. So I say, no, we take the overwhelming majority consensus of what this root means, which is assembly. So therefore, when we're looking at my favor upon you, yada yada, when you spoke to the people in the cradle, right? And the justification, of course, is because wakalan means middle-aged man, you see, Aki. Well, if we understand this as being assembly, that opens up what this other word would mean. How am I going to explain this now? So assembly, right? If this is to take the meaning, what I put here, right, of the company of heaven, or the assembly of heaven, then it would be the true body of the righteous gathered before God, or the eternal communion of the elect. So this would be, in a sense, in heaven, so beyond the earthly world. And the reason I'm emphasizing that is that if we then understand this not as maturity, right, but instead as assembly, and we then keep this open as potentially what it could be, then it's that he spoke to people in something, and then also in the assembly in heaven. Okay, just putting that as a framework because there's a lot of floating parts here, and I'll get back to it. So, what does the Gez say about this Mahdi or Hadi or Hadda? And by the way, back to what you were saying about how it's most likely going to be pronounced in the original rendering as Mahada, right? That's what we see here as the phonetic actually being Mahada. Hadu. Okay. And the reason why I'm putting this down here, right, is because potentially it's talking about return, because the Hadda root in the in the Abyssinian, so in the Gez, in the Ethiopic, has the meaning of returning or to come back to. And if you put the min, then it becomes return as such. And then this is a broader form that's not actually what we see in the Quranic text, but I was going to put it here anyway as like the one who returns, hypothetically. But that's rendered with the Gez grammar. So I kind of want to put the idea of the returning one in everyone's minds as potentially derived from the Ethiopic through the root of Hadda as returning to. Let's look now specifically at the verse again.
If I may, one of the key features of the Mahdi, as it is understood now by the Shias, is the guy that returns, right, from the year 93 something. So they're waiting for his return from this obscure realm, wherever actually that they believe that he is. He's like in exile. So even the meaning of returning, it sort of matches the current understanding of what the Mahdi has to do. He's not somebody that is born. He's someone who returns, actually.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So that's why it shapes in the Shia tradition with this idea that you're putting forward, for sure. So yeah, so we're looking at this Gez meaning as potentially being one of the origins. I highlighted it, especially the whole Kana coming from the Gez, for this exact point, because I'm going to put forward that we should be understanding both Mahdi or Mahada in this context, as well as Sabiyan, the next word after, in accordance with the Gez. So bear with me here, all right? So she referred unto him, and they said, how should we talk with he who was, which is because of the Kana was, a boy comes from the Sabiyan, you can see in the bottom left, child, this meaning. Murad puts in the smoothness for Mahdi or Mahada, right? Because the whole idea of cradle, he couldn't in good confidence put that there. So he rendered it as smoothness, which is very interesting, but I think itself, this might be a distraction. So I also wanted to highlight this verse because we see this root Hadi, but with the other form, with the ending Aleph, which we were talking about briefly before, as being interesting, because look, have not we made the earth, al-ard, a resting place? In the context, it seems kind of weird to talk about how the earth is a resting place. So if it is about this root is about somehow returning or something, then have we not made the land returning? But if it is this idea of tabari, of rightly guided, maybe have we not made the land rightly guided? I also wanted to put this up here just to talk about, just to talk about the ard word, because I think it's funny. This word very clearly derives from the Hebrew eretz. The problem here is that the phonetic ard is very different from the phonetic, that we see here of aleph, ra, sadeh. How do we get from aleph, ra, sadeh to aleph, ra, dad? Well, you add a dot to the sadeh to make it a dad. So the origin of this word seems to actually come through a orthographic form as a medium. That means that it couldn't have gone through the phonetic in the sense that someone says eretz and then someone says, oh, I heard ard. No, that doesn't work. So instead, what it seems that happened is that the original text was actually referring to this root, and then the adding of the dot then creates an entirely different word, which is a total neologism, however, retains the same meaning. So it's translated as the earth, which is very much the same as like the land or the earth. As you can see, the secondary meaning is earth. So yeah, just as a funny side point, you can very clearly see how the origin of art actually comes through a orthographic origin, in the sense that what was actually originally written presumably was aleph, ra, sadeh, and then they made up a new word. So it sort of it reinforces what we are speculating in the sense of this sad dad. But back to the Mahdi. So to know more about what we're talking about with the Mahdi, let's look at the next word. So you can see here we're going to the next manuscript because it's the beginning of the manuscript where we see that the next word continue. This root is only attested 3 times, and only twice in the form we're looking at. The other time, it is with the aleph instead of at the end, and also without a y. So it's just aleph, sad, ba, which would render it essentially in the I verb form. So I do this. So what does this root mean? We're again in a situation of a rotten root. Why? Well, because, one second, we have in the Hebrew, this root means to desire, to wish for, to assemble, or beauty. In Aramaic, it means desire, so consistent, to want, to wish for. It's very similar, you can imagine. So it's consistent, right? It means to desire, to want, to wish for. Same then again in Syriac, obviously it's a dialect of Aramaic, makes sense, willed, desired, but also specifically chosen one appears. Very interesting. Also voluntary or willfully is also a meaning that's associated with this root. However, I want to highlight the Ethiopic, because in the Ethiopic, it does also have a connotation of desire as a tertiary meaning, but the primary usage of this root in the Ethiopic is actually the proper term for baptism, to immerse someone, to pour over someone, to baptize them. So that's why I've highlighted that in bold. It seems that this may be of interest, because usually when you have, like in the other root here, if we look here, when you have all of the meanings consistent, even the Ethiopic is consistent, and then you have a totally different meaning in the Arabic. This is different here, because what we're looking at here is a divergence in the Ethiopic and a divergence, quote unquote, in the Arabic, right? So, but this root is then used in the Ethiopic tradition in their literature. And although the manuscripts date from later, we can assume that this tradition was retained as their biblical tradition. So this was used as the term for baptize, which is a unique phenomena among the Semitic sister languages. And then in the Arabic, of course, we have another totally different meaning, which is to incline toward, which is kind of like a euphemism for desire, right? Which is kind of interesting. To incline towards. I desire this. I incline towards it. I have a bias towards it. And it also has this retaining of the desire. But, and very crucially, as we see in the concordance image, the way it's translated in Surah 19, it only occurs with this form in Surah 19. And in Surah 19, it's twice occurring and both times translated as a child. I don't know how you want to derive that. Is it because you desire children? I don't want to think about that being the reason for the derivation, right? But, or like, I wouldn't be able to tell you or speculate. But this divergence to suddenly mean child, it's strange. It's strange. which is probably why Murad does not translate it as child. Or he does, sorry. The other word he doesn't translate, my bad. But anyway, so we have this meaning of desire or wish for potentially as being the meaning of this sabiya. Also looking at the potential for baptize or immerse through the Ethiopic derivation. And, cool. I'm just going to put another here. So this is a specific look at the Syriac for the whole desire, wishing, almost kind of like a longing for in a sense, like who's promised for, right? Who you wish or who pleases you. But this is then the Ethiopic, which I want to highlight because this is then in the Gez, it takes the meaning of to spill over. So overflowing or to pour out, to spill, to flow, right? There's this idea of, you can see very much why it's associated with baptism because it's the overflowing of water. So that's then the Sabian word. I want to look at this other verse, which is earlier in the Surah 19, where we see the other instance of the Sabiyan, which is translated again as just a child, where you then see the translators put in when he was to make it make sense, because in the context it's simply talking about, and we gave him al-hukma, the wisdom. We gave him al-hikmah, Sabiyan. And then it's translated as we gave him the wisdom, and then Sabiyan, a child, when he was. Okay, we fixed it. So he got wisdom as a child. But this is sort of weird, and it doesn't really work. And why is it that John, we know him as John the Baptist, right? That's what he's known for, right? He's the baptizer, okay? So why is it that when we're reading Surah 19 and it's talking about John, it doesn't mention anything about him being a baptizer at all? Or maybe it does, right? I looked at the Ethiopic. This word means baptism or overflow, water, so forth. So maybe we do actually have John as being called a Baptist of some kind. So I put here maybe the wisdom of baptism. He was given the wisdom of baptism. He was given the baptism of wisdom. I don't know exactly. I also want to highlight the definite articles here because, totally speculatively, we do actually have two forms here where you have the definite article in the beginning in one, and then you have the definite article hypothetically in accordance with the Aramaic grammar in the other. And we were looking in the definite article live stream, which you can find on our channel. It was one of the earliest live streams. We talked about how in Surah 4, you see these forms at the end of verses where they end with both the definite article at the end, right? So it would be, instead of al-aziz al-hakim, it would be aziza hakima, right? So you have the same exact form, which is attested elsewhere with these like Allahian declarations of he is so-and-so, so-and-so. But in some instances of the Quran, it's rendered with a definite article at the end, and the other instances with a definite article in the front. What if, hypothetically, what if it was possible that you could actually have both forms in the same spot where it was originally meant to be both on, both having the definite article, just hypothetically? Then you would have to render it as like a conjoined noun, and then it would mean something like the wise baptism, potentially, or something like that. But even if we don't speculate in that realm, I want to put it out there just so people have that in their mind. Maybe we've got something like that going on. But if we put that aside, we're just looking at these two words here of related to John the Baptist, or just John, if we go according to the sin, because he's not a Baptist apparently. But maybe he is a Baptist according to the Quran. And this word Sabiyan, which is only, like I said, occurs these two times in the same chapter. And it just so happens to be about John and Jesus, which are both baptizers. What's the chances that you have this root, which means baptism in the Ethiopic, twice in the verse, and it's being translated now as child, and then it's being fixed by putting in brackets when he was a child to make it make sense in the context of Yahya? So I think that either we have the meaning of baptism with the Sabian root, or this word here, or the standard Syriac, which would be desired or longed for or wished for. But I'm leaning towards baptism because of what I just laid out. Why is there no talking about John the Baptist or Jesus being baptized or baptizing others, or where is this? Maybe it is there and it's no longer being read properly. So to sum it kind of all the way up here, it wasn't a totally thorough analysis. We just wanted to specifically talk and discuss this one verse. We looked at some other verses for context to see, okay, what was going on there. I do want to go back to the whole congregation thing here. And the reason why I brought this up is because the interpretation I'm going to try and put forward here actually works for both this context and also the context of what we were just looking at. And what I want to put forward is this idea that existed in certain Christian traditions, particularly in the Jewish Christian traditions, such as the Nazareans, the Ebionites, more so with the Ebionites. It differed depending on the tradition and depending on the time period. But there was this Christ spirit theology. Essentially, this was a group that would believe in Jesus as being the Christ. However, they would be incarnation, as in permanent incarnation deniers. They believed that Christ was the Messiah, or more specifically, that Jesus had the Messiah in him, but not that he ever really became the Messiah, or that he really was, in a real sense, ever truly the Messiah, as like in a nature sense. Rather, they believed that the Christ Spirit dwelt among Jesus at the moment of baptism, and then from the moment of baptism until his death, he hence was dwelled in him the Holy Spirit, and then before the crucifixion, before the passion, that Spirit hence the Spirit left him, went back up to God, because the Spirit was loved too much for God to let the Spirit suffer, and this kind of, I think, maps together a lot of these different things that are going on. I believe there's some element of this whole Christ Spirit theology potentially at play in the original Quranic authors. And I wanted to put that forward so that we could interpret this in line of that. So if you will speak, or you spoke through the power of the Holy Spirit to people in, and then if Mahdi is the Mahdi here, actually, this is the Mahdi, right? In the Mahdi. So you spoke to people in the Mahdi. So while the Spirit was in the human, in the rightly guided, in the returning one, whichever one we want to go with here, right? I think it's going to be the returning one, probably from the Ethiopic, right? Then it would be, you will speak to people in the body of this human. Wa kalan, or kalan. Wa in the assembly. And the reason why I think that would be relevant here is it would be essentially saying, you will speak to people in the flesh as well as in the congregation of God in heaven, implicitly asserting a position that there was no permanent incarnation, that the Spirit of Christ will speak in the rightly guided, or the returning one, and then will also speak in the congregation without a physical body. So that's why that would sort of be read in, make sense of this verse with the re-rendering of this whole maturity thing, which is not attested anywhere except for the Arabic, presumably, supposedly. And then here, if we understand it also similarly, then it would say something along the lines of how we speak who was or is in, and then these are potentially options here, in the returner, in the returning as such, in the rightly guided one, to sort of, have the Tabari kind of implicit association. And then we have desired, or wished, or hoped for, or immersed, baptized, or poured out, overflowing. So this is the rendering I'm leaning towards, how we speak to who was in the returning one baptized. Why was I talking about the whole baptism, Holy Spirit thing? Well, because this would line up with what they're talking about. They're not trying to speak to the flesh, right? Because they're good non-associators, right? So they're asking, how do we speak to the one who's in the flesh? How do we speak to who was in the returning one baptized, in the Mahdi baptized? And that would then make sense of the Holy Spirit going into Christ upon baptism, and then you speaking to the one who was baptized. Then you would counter argue, but wasn't he baptized when he was 30 years old? I thought this is talking about him as a baby. The thing is, there is no actual, nothing in the text necessarily makes it clear or states that this must be a child. We only assume that Christ is a child in the context of this verse because of the translation of the cradle, because of the translation of Sabian as child, right? So these two words being rendered with this sort of non-attested meaning across any other Semitic language, this and also rarely being used in the Quranic text quite, this rendering is what gives us this idea that there is somehow a baby Jesus involved here, right? And therefore, by context, in the next verse, when he says, I am, surely I am the servant of Allah and blah, 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 the assumption is, oh, this is a baby talking. because we just read a verse that makes it clear that this is about a child in a cradle. But what if it's not so? If we take that out, then this was never talking about a baby Jesus in the beginning. Instead, it was putting forward this whole Christ Spirit theology instead, where you're not speaking to Jesus, you're seeking to speak to who is or was in the Mahdi baptized. That's what I wanted to put forward as this hypothetical uh, analysis of this verse. It bears further investigation. However, what I would put forward is this: if the Mahdi is so important, and we have this Mahdi form, without the ya at the end, but again, it could have derived from the phonetic of the Ethiopic, which is the Mahada, which is the returning, right? So if you had Mahada as a word for returning or second coming, then you put the definite article in the Arabic onto that loan word, and then you get al Mahada. So then that would become the returning one, or the returning. So that's what I was going to put forward, JC. What are your thoughts on what I've put forward so far?
That's that's really really good. And the whole thing with Mahdi, we thought that is one of those words that you would expect to find it in the Quran, and it seems to be something like a Messiah figure, which then goes back to the in the actual traditions gets developed. Now, with these verses, I think one of the reasons why we assume that, well, it has to be talking about baby Jesus is because of the pseudo gospels, and we know that they have borrowed the stuff from the pseudo gospels, or maybe they haven't. As we actually dig deeper, maybe those are stories that they heard as they were canonizing the Quran, and they forced that meaning into the Quran. So we'll have to look into all of those words. But because we know that the pseudo gospels talk about baby Jesus speaking, then that appears in the Quran, and we basically just stop looking at that. But now looking at that word as either assembly or returning, and as you were explaining this, the first thing that came to mind is like, okay, so returning, it could be either talking about the time when he actually returns after the crucifixion. So it could be talking about that, could be talking about the day of judgment, when, according to the Islamic traditions, Jesus returns. So that is not a belief that they could actually sponge from the records. So they still have that belief. And about the assembly as well, it could be, like you said, the heavenly host to actually be speaking basically on this earth and also in heaven, or when he returns, or something like that. And the other word, which was um,
You can
well,
put on.
about
I I
baptism.
I reshared the screen. I know I accidentally put off the screen, but it's now on again. So we can go to the slide if you put it on the StreamYard.
There was just okay. Well, let me actually put it on. There was something else that came to mind. So when he returns, if you can go to the last page, perhaps. Oh no, you have stopped sharing. Doesn't really matter. We're actually just trying to debrief. One thing that actually always bothered me was it. The verse seemed to be a little bit redundant because it says, like, how can we speak with him in the cradle as a boy? And he's like, okay, fair enough, as a cradle, in the cradle as a boy. In English, that would sound redundant because you're actually saying two different sentences there, or two parts of the sentence, which they mean the same thing. If it's in the cradle, he's not going to be a grown up man in the cradle. You already imply that he's an actual infant. So it would just say, if you wanted to be very direct, say, how can we speak with him when he's an infant or when he's a newborn? But to say in the cradle as a boy, it seems to be a bit redundant. Also, just saying as a boy, if you said as a baby, you cover the whole ground. You don't have to say the cradle. What if he is not sleeping in a cradle? What if he's actually sleeping in his mother's arms? It's like, why cradle and then as a boy? It's just that thing, that redundant statement in there never made sense to me. So when you said, hey, look, this is actually like Mahdi. Okay, Mahdi is either he who returns or something to do with an assembly or a Messiah figure. It's like, now it makes sense. Perhaps it's actually talking about how can we speak with him in the like the spirit of God on this earth, or something more esoterical. But in any case, as happy as I always was with they have borrowed this from the pseudo gospels, now I'm not that happy with that, and I think there is probably something along the lines of what you have explained today. Maybe there is a little bit more of digging that we need to do on those verses, but it seems to be more esoterical and no baby Jesus is speaking from the cradle.
Yeah, the feeling I get essentially is so we have this textual tradition, it exists. People no longer can read it, right? So, what would make sense to me is that there's folk stories being spoken of. People are constantly talking about different stories, infancy gospel here or there, right? This, that. And then they need to understand the text and they hear the story about Jesus speaking in the cradle, and then they read that into this context. That would seem to potentially be the way that this worked.
Yes. And right after that is when we keep reading other verses that they are as well like quite vague, and we actually write the story for the authors. If we are saying, okay, so now he's a baby, and then people are saying bad things about Mary, but then someone speak, you are going to assume, okay, so this is going to be baby Jesus speaking to the crowd, saying, no, 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 she was really a virgin, and I actually come from the heavens, or something like that. But we are reading that into the text when it's not. And we have seen already quite a few examples where they will just change something to ensure that the audience don't understand what is going on. In this case, it would make sense if they're trying to push everything to baby Jesus, when perhaps the reality is a lot more theologically heavy, something to do with post resurrection, coming back from the heavens, speaking with angels, or something like that. Certainly, they would try to hide that. So good find. I really actually like that one. And I look forward to the next dodgy words that we see in the Quran and we want to actually explore in more detail.
Yes, I also want to point out a couple more speculations in a sense. So, if we do draw upon this meaning of the returning one, the one who returns, this, like you said about the whole Mahdi idea, it does track with the Shia conception of the Mahdi, but also it 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 would have had a particular usage, right? In the sense that if you are identifying a Messiah and then calling him the returning one, then you have already uh, totally struck from possibility the idea of the two Messiah model, which is then becomes the predominant belief in rabbinic Judaism, right? Because if you say that this is the Messiah and that we call him the returning one, right? There is no second Messiah then, because if the reason why they have the whole two Messiah model is because one Messiah is the suffering servant, and the other one is this idea of the Davidic king, right? The righteous king, and of course we understand Christ as being both, and he fulfilled the first mission to suffer and die for the sins of the world, and then he will return in righteous judgment at the end of days. So this is our conception of Christ, and that would fall in line with the idea of referring to al-Masih Mahda, right? Because that therefore excludes the idea. It basically rebuffs the idea of a two Messiah model, right? It would explicitly affirm this Messiah came and he will return, and therefore we do not affirm a two Messiah model. That would be pretty interesting. If that was the intent of the author, it would make sense.
Yeah, it could be. And then they split between Sunni and Shia. Sunnis, they believe until probably very, very late on that Jesus returns. And it's still the belief that they have to this day, except that through their traditions, they start removing all of the powers. It's like, yeah, he returns, but he returns so that he fights the Antichrist. Oh, and then he dies, and then nobody cares about it. As opposed to, no, he's coming back and to judge and all of that. So they remove the story. They cannot remove from the memories of people that Jesus is the one that returns on the day of judgment. So they just edit all of that story to just make him incredibly unimportant and just a servant who just does what somebody has told him to do, what God has told him to do, but not Muhammad, but Jesus returning. And then when we go to the Shias, they change the belief even more by saying, no, 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 actually the returning guy is one of our guys who comes back at one point. And what is he going to bring? Well, the Quran, the actual knowledge of God, not the one that we have because it's been, tampered with by Umar and by Uthman and everybody else, but the true knowledge of God, the Mahdi will bring that. And he's like, okay, so it looks like they all started from a very Christian point of view, and then they edited everything, and here we are.
It's super interesting because essentially, if we're right about this, or if I'm right about this idea of the whole returning one, right? Therefore, what it essentially would do is that at one point they say Jesus is the title, the returning one, right? Jesus is the one who returns. Okay, simple, right? So Jesus is the Mahada, right? Okay, cool. But then over 100 years, right, or hundreds of years, then you have the idea of the Mahada, but you don't know what it means anymore, right? So you have the Mahada, which means the returning one, right? And then you still believe that the Mahada will return, but you forgot that Mahada is just a title that means returning one. So then you start saying the returning one will return, right? And then now you start to make this Mahadi into a meaning like the rightly guided one or this eschatological figure and so forth, right? As if the returning one, the title, the returning one, is simply something devoid, right? It started as simply being a title for Christ, and then over time it becomes its own standalone thing, right? But retains the idea that it will return, right? So this whole mess here can kind of make sense of the situation. So yeah, that's all I wanted to go through. So this is it. That's the wrap.
Okay. Well, that's great. We will return on Thursday to speak about more things. Let's actually, Cash, speak up after this about what we're going to talk about on Thursday. I think we both know what it's going to be, but let's actually have that discussion, and then we reconvene then. Any final words, Cash, before we go?
We will return on Thursday, and Christ will return soon.
Okay. Well, thank you everyone for watching. God bless you all, and we will see you soon. Hopefully this Thursday. Bye bye.
Thank you
Have a good
all.
one.
Bye bye.